The first thing I remember is the sound, not the steady hiss that usually filled my living room like a soft heartbeat, but the way it stopped. A sharp silence, then the rasp of the tubing being yanked from its socket. The air disappeared as if someone had turned off the world. My chest tightened instantly. My throat felt like it was wrapped in cold wire. I turned my head slowly. Sophie was standing over the oxygen concentrator. My tubing hung from her hand like a dead snake. She looked at me with the calm of someone folding laundry. "Sign the papers," she said, voice quiet, steady, terrifying. "Or breathe your last breath alone." My body reacted before my brain did. I pushed my hands against the hardwood floor, dragging myself toward the spare tank in the corner. The thin rubber of the tubing scraped against my cheek. My pulse pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. The tank was just out of reach. Sophie took one step forward, lifted her bare foot, and kicked it. It rolled into the shadows under the table with a hollow metallic clang. I gasped. No air. No air. My fingers curled against the floorboards like claws. The world began to tilt. My lungs burned, begging for something that was no longer there. I could still see her. Sophie's shoulders were relaxed, like this was just another Sunday night. She tilted her head. "You have always needed me," she whispered. "You do now more than ever." There was a faint ringing in my ears. My chest rose and fell fast, but it was useless. Without the machine, every breath came like dragging broken glass through my throat. A flash of memory cut through the panic. Summer of 1979. 2 girls on the roof of a weathered porch. I was 10. She was 13. My chest was tight from childhood asthma, and I was scared. Sophie pressed her little hand over mine and whispered, "I'll always protect you." I believed her. The living room came rushing back. She leaned closer now. "Not anymore," she said. The same mouth. The same sister. But the promise was gone. I tried to speak but only managed a wet, choking sound. The air was too thin. I dragged myself forward, nails scraping the floor. I needed the tank. I needed anything. She crouched down. For a moment, her face was just inches from mine. I saw the wrinkle near her eye, the place where time had softened her. She looked human. She looked like my sister. That almost hurt more than the air. She reached out and pressed her hand on my shoulder. "Sign it," she said again. "You do this and we end it clean. No more fighting." Fighting! As if the years of silent resentment the side comments the way she measured every breath I took had just been a friendly game. I shook my head. She squeezed harder. My vision started to pulse black at the edges. The room shrank into a single sound, my own breath failing. I thought about the first time the doctor said COPD. I thought about how hard I fought to live my life after that. The portable tank strapped to my shoulder when I still taught first graders, the way the kids never stared, the way Sophie did. I thought about nights when I woke up choking and she was the one who came running. That was years ago. A different version of her. A different version of me. My fingers brushed against the cold leg of the coffee table. I hooked them around the wood, dragging my weight closer to where the tank had rolled. My chest screamed for air, my back arched from the pain of trying to breathe nothing. Sophie's voice cut through again. Calm, almost gentle. "Sign the papers." She held up the pen with the same hand that once braided my hair before school. Something inside me cracked. It was not just fear. It was grief. My sister was no longer a sister. She was the thing standing between me and the air. I tried to push up on my elbows, but the strength slid away. My head fell forward and hit the floor. The smell of the wood was sharp and familiar. I heard the machine still clicking uselessly. She stood above me like a calm shadow. She did not scream. She did not cry. She just watched, like she was already waiting for the last sound to leave my body. Another flashback, that winter when I was 12 and the cold sent me into a fit. She ran outside barefoot in the snow, screaming for help. She saved me once. I had believed that meant something. The world tilted again. I could feel my lips trembling. My lungs rattled like dry leaves. The cold floor pressed against my cheek. I forced my arm forward one more time. My fingers caught the base of the tank, but Sophie's foot pressed down on it lightly, not even enough to hurt, just enough to say she controlled it. I stared up at her. She stared down at me. My vision blurred. My breath was shallow. She smiled. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who has already decided something. She leaned close enough for me to see the small freckle under her eye. "I decide when you breathe," she said. Something shifted inside me, a cold spark of rage. Not loud, not wild, just quiet and sharp. I pressed my hand against the floor again and dragged myself just an inch closer. The tank was almost in reach. If I could just get it. If I could just last one more second. Sophie laughed. Soft. Not cruel. Almost like she was remembering a joke from long ago. She stood up and walked to the sideboard, leaving the tank where it was. She had already decided I would give in. I stared at the pen. It was still in her hand. The papers waited on the table. My chest heaved like a broken bellows. A thought formed in the thin oxygen left inside my head. If she took away the air, I could still take away her victory. I was not going to sign. The shadows around the room grew darker. The lamp over the couch flickered with the weak light of winter. My body started to shake. She came back crouched down again. "You cannot hold out forever," she said softly. "No one is coming. No one cares." I wanted to scream, but the sound never came. Just another wheeze. Just another hollow breath. Another memory surfaced. The night she stayed up with me after my first oxygen tank was delivered. She had whispered, "Then I will always look out for you." I met her eyes now and saw nothing left of that promise. My hand finally reached the tank. My fingers closed around the cold metal. It was mine. My air. She turned sharply. Her eyes narrowed. I did not have the strength to fight. But I had the will. I pressed the release valve with my thumb. A weak hiss of air escaped. She froze. Her lips parted. For the first time that night, she looked uncertain. I pulled the tank close to my chest. She straightened her voice low and hard. "You will regret this." I did not care. The hiss of air was all I needed. She reached for the tank again, but I clutched it tighter. Every breath I stole back was a small rebellion. My voice came out rough, cracked, but real. "No." She froze. For a brief moment, we were just two sisters again. One gasping for breath, one holding the power to end it. And then it was gone. She turned away. My lungs burned, but they were mine again. I do not remember how long I lay there gasping, clutching the tank like it was my own heartbeat. I only remember the words she whispered before leaving the room. "This is not over." And in that moment, with the weak hiss of air keeping me alive, I knew this was just the beginning. What would you do if your own sister ripped the air from your lungs? Before everything collapsed, it was just a house. A quiet, fading house at the edge of Asheville with paint peeling at the porch and old trees pressing shadows across the lawn. I moved back here after I left my teaching job, believing that this house with its familiar floors and worn air would keep me safe. It had been our parents' house. Sophie never left. She was always here tending to it like a soldier guarding a broken wall. When they died 5 years ago, the house became ours together, not because we wanted it that way, but because the will said so. It was supposed to be simple, but nothing between sisters ever is. She was the older one, the strong one. The one who believed she had sacrificed her freedom while I lived my life. I had been the little sister with the good grades, the steady teaching job, the friends at church. When the diagnosis came, COPD, everything turned upside down. The breath I once took for granted became something measured in tanks, in minutes, in soft mechanical noises at night. I moved home because I needed the house. Sophie believed I moved home because I wanted her to take care of me. That was the beginning of everything ugly. At first, it was subtle. She'd mention at family dinners how tired she was from helping me out, how she was always the one keeping things together. Neighbors at the grocery store would ask how I was doing, but they'd also pat her shoulder like she was the hero of my story. I remember her smile then, too tight, too fixed. That was the smile of someone who wanted applause but got crumbs. The resentment sat beneath her skin like rust beneath paint. She told me once standing in the kitchen that I had always been the favorite. I laughed it off because we were grown women and old grievances were supposed to fade, but hers never did. It simmered. It twisted around every word, every action. When people brought casseroles or flowers or cards for me, she'd set them down hard on the counter like each kind gesture was a nail in her own coffin. At the church potluck one afternoon, Pastor Miller put his hand on my shoulder and said how strong I was. Sophie stood behind me smiling. Later at home, she said quietly, "No one ever says I'm strong." I tried to explain it wasn't a competition. I didn't choose this disease. She looked at me like she didn't believe a word. Her jealousy didn't come in shouting matches. It came in whispers, little digs. One night she said, "Must be nice to have everyone care so much about you." I asked her what she meant. She laughed. Nothing, just talking. But it wasn't nothing. Every kind word I received made her colder. Every phone call from an old student checking on me every meal train delivery, every neighbor who offered to help with the yard, it all built a quiet wall between us. She began telling people she felt short of breath sometimes. She said it like an afterthought, like it didn't matter. But it did. She repeated it again and again. She watched the way people reacted to me and started copying the script. At first, I thought it was her way of trying to understand me. But then I realized she wanted the attention that came with being sick without the sickness itself. She started skipping shifts at the diner, telling coworkers she had lung issues too. She asked to borrow my inhaler just in case. She mimicked my cough at dinner. She even sat down next to me during a house visit from my respiratory therapist, claiming she was feeling a tightness. The therapist gave her a polite smile, but I saw the calculation in Sophie's eyes. She wasn't pretending out of empathy. She was trying to be me. But she could never be me. And that, more than anything, enraged her. Our parents' house became a stage. Every chair in the living room, every mug in the kitchen, every framed photo on the wall carried a history that belonged to both of us. But in her mind, this house was hers. She stayed. I left. I should have never come back. One evening after choir practice, 2 neighbors came over with homemade soup. Sophie opened the door before I could get up from the couch. She accepted their kindness with a glowing face, then told them she had been taking care of me day and night. They looked at her with admiration. She soaked it up like sunlight. When the door closed, she turned and gave me a look I'll never forget. It was a small thing, a flick of the eyes, but it said everything. She didn't want to be my sister anymore. She wanted to be the martyr. It wasn't just attention, it was control. The disease I carried had made me fragile. Her resentment made her strong in all the wrong ways. I thought the worst thing she could do was lie. But resentment left long enough turns into something sharper. I noticed little changes around the house. One of my portable tanks would be missing for a few hours. A box of spare filters moved from one shelf to another without explanation. She said she was just helping reorganize. I didn't want to believe otherwise. But every time something vanished, her smile got tighter. There were nights when she didn't come home right away. When she did, she'd bring up how tired she was from keeping this place together. I told myself I was imagining the way her tone shifted when she said this house like it was already hers alone. At the same time, people kept noticing me less and her more. She became the storyteller, the one who narrated my illness to others like it was her own drama to perform. She started sitting beside me at appointments, interrupting me to tell nurses about my breathing patterns. It wasn't her story, but she wore it like it was. And when people started believing her, something in her changed. That night in the kitchen when she whispered, "You've always had everything," I realized this wasn't new. This had been building since childhood. I remembered the way she used to glare when I got good grades, or how she'd remind people she was the older one. This house had only trapped us inside an old resentment that never died. That resentment would become the weapon she used to take everything away from me, one breath at a time. It started slowly, the way a draft seeps under a door before anyone notices. Sophie began folding herself into my illness in quiet, deliberate steps. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen holding my inhaler in her hand, turning it over like it was some kind of relic. She said her chest had been tight lately and that maybe she should see a doctor too. I thought nothing of it at first. I told her if she felt something was wrong, she should go, but the doctor visit never happened. Instead, she began echoing my symptoms at perfectly timed moments. When I coughed, she coughed. When I complained about the weight of the portable tank, she sighed as if her lungs ached too. When visitors asked how I was doing, she jumped in with, "We're having a hard week." Not me. We. She inserted herself into my story without permission. I remember the first time she pretended to gasp. It was during Sunday service. I was sitting near the back trying to keep my breathing steady through the hymns. Out of nowhere, Sophie clutched her chest dramatically. People turned. The pastor paused mid-sentence. She coughed a neat imitation of mine and said she felt lightheaded. By the end of the hour, she had received 3 offers for rides home, 2 casseroles, and a dozen pitying glances. I sat there feeling invisible. After that, the performances grew sharper. She would lean against the counter, holding her hand to her chest with a practiced frown. She mimicked the soft, shallow breaths that I had spent years trying to hide from the world. She timed her fake wheezes for when neighbors visited. She told people she had trouble climbing the stairs too. She even bought a cheap humidifier and placed it next to her bed, telling people it helped her breathe at night. I started to recognize it as an act, but it was the kind of act you can't call out without sounding cruel. If I said she was lying, I'd look like the sick sister jealous of the healthy one. She knew that. She played that angle perfectly. She began moving my equipment. A portable oxygen tank disappeared for half a day and came back without explanation. A box of nasal cannulas ended up under her bed. When I confronted her, she shrugged and said she was just helping. Her voice always held that calm, sugar-sweet tone that made me doubt my own instincts. Gaslighting is quiet like that. It doesn't scream. It whispers. She started sitting next to me during visits from the respiratory nurse. She would answer questions meant for me. "She's been coughing more at night," she'd say, while I stared at her in disbelief. The nurse nodded, scribbling notes, never realizing those words didn't belong to Sophie. She copied everything about my condition down to the way I held my chest when I was out of breath. At church events, she made sure to sit near me so she could mirror my movements. When I reached for water, she reached for water. When my breathing grew strained, she sighed theatrically. She wanted their eyes. She wanted their pity. But underneath the soft voice and gentle gestures, something sharp was growing. I saw it in the way she looked at me when no one else was watching. Cold, calculating, like a magician who has mastered a trick and is waiting for applause. The first big shift came when she began using my diagnosis for her own gain. She called the utility company pretending to be me to get a medical hardship discount on the power bill. I found out when they sent the confirmation letter. She laughed when I confronted her, said, "Well, it helps both of us, doesn't it?" The second came when she applied for a local assistance program meant for patients with chronic illness. She forged my signature, signed her name, and claimed the funds for herself. I didn't even know until months later when the church treasurer mentioned how generous the program was for both sisters. I was stunned. She was building a second life out of my sickness. One night after dinner, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly, and said, "You know, people really love how strong I've been through all of this." I asked, "Through what?" She smiled softly. "Your illness, our journey." The way she said "our" made my skin crawl. That was the moment I realized she didn't see my condition as something that happened to me. She saw it as a stage she had a right to stand on. The manipulations became more deliberate after that. She told people at the diner that her breathing was getting worse. She showed up to church with a small portable fan around her neck, claiming it helped when she felt like she couldn't breathe. She began rehearsing lines in front of the bathroom mirror, lines I knew because they were mine. I used to tell doctors, "The nights are the worst. Lying down feels like my lungs are closing." I heard her say the same sentence to our neighbor Marianne one afternoon, down to the pauses. I watched from the hallway as Marianne patted her arm, concern flooding her face. Sophie caught my eye and smiled like a thief who knew she would never get caught. Then she started cutting into my space. Literally. She moved her things into the spare room where I kept my extra tanks. She called it sharing storage. She rearranged my medications, my tubing, my nebulizer equipment, everything. At first, it was irritating. Then it became frightening. I woke one morning to find my primary oxygen tank unplugged. She claimed she'd tripped over the cord during the night. Another day, I found my rescue inhaler missing from the drawer beside my bed. It reappeared in the kitchen hours later. She said she had borrowed it to compare brands, but she never used an inhaler. Not really. She was tightening control over every piece of the thing that kept me alive. She started answering phone calls from the home health agency before I could. She intercepted mail about my prescriptions. She signed for deliveries. She called the oxygen company pretending to be me. And every time I confronted her, she laughed softly like I was being dramatic. "Ellie," she said one night, pouring herself tea like nothing was wrong. "I'm just trying to make things easier." I began to feel like I was disappearing from my own life. My voice didn't matter. My illness didn't even belong to me anymore. She had taken it, dressed it in sympathy, and claimed it as hers. At church, they started asking her how she was feeling. Not me. Her. It was a slow theft of identity, of control, of dignity. A theft no one could see but me. And underneath that theft, something darker was simmering. It wasn't enough for her to share my story. She wanted to rewrite it entirely. The final straw came one evening when I walked into the living room and found her holding my portable tank with a soft smile, whispering the words I used to say when my chest tightened like she was rehearsing a role. Her eyes weren't on me. They were on the mirror. She looked like she was ready to become me completely. That was the night I understood. This wasn't jealousy anymore. This was a takeover. And she wouldn't stop at my story. She would take the air itself if it meant I would have none left. The morning it happened was quiet. Too quiet. There was always a soft hum in the house, a steady background sound that followed me like a shadow. The oxygen concentrator was my constant companion. That low, rhythmic sound told me I was safe, that the air would keep flowing. But that morning when I opened my eyes, there was nothing. No hum. No flow. Just silence. My chest tightened before I even sat up. It always did when something was wrong. I reached for the nasal cannula, but it was limp and lifeless. My breath came short and shallow, and the familiar panic pressed at the edges of my ribs. I looked at the machine. It was unplugged. The cord lay slack on the floor like a dead vein. For one small moment, I thought it might be a mistake. Maybe I had tripped over it during the night. Maybe the plug had come loose. My hands shook as I tried to reinsert it into the outlet, but then I heard movement in the kitchen. She was awake. "Sophie." The sound of her spoon tapping the edge of her mug was steady, careless, like she was making coffee on any ordinary morning. I walked toward her, slowly dragging the tube behind me like a leash. The air was getting thinner with each step. She turned around, her robe tied loosely, her hair still damp from a shower, and she smiled. "Oh," she said softly. "Did the machine stop?" I stared at her. "It's unplugged," I managed to say between shallow breaths. "Oh, I must have tripped over it last night," she said, her tone too light, too smooth, like a rehearsed line. My breathing hitched. It wasn't just the air, it was the way she said it. Like it wasn't important, like my lungs didn't matter. I reached for the plug again, but my hands trembled. I could feel the tightness crawling up from my diaphragm, wrapping around my chest like invisible wire. She stood there watching me, not helping, just watching. My fingers finally got the plug back into the wall, and the machine hummed to life, sending that first cool rush of air into my nose. My knees went weak from relief. I held the counter for support and stared at her. "You didn't try to help," I whispered. Her smile never wavered. "You're fine now, aren't you?" she said. I should have seen it then. That smile was not carelessness. It was pleasure. I was a problem she could control, and for the first time, she had tasted that control. That afternoon, I found my portable tank missing. I searched the house for 20 minutes, my breathing growing worse with each step. When I finally found it behind the washing machine, hidden under an old blanket, I confronted her. "Why would you move this?" I asked. She tilted her head like she didn't understand the question. "Maybe you left it there." I hadn't. I always kept it by the bedroom door. Always. I told myself to let it go because the alternative was to admit something I wasn't ready to face. But the fear had already rooted itself in my chest deeper than the disease. 2 days later, the same thing happened. The machine was off again, this time in the middle of the night. I woke, choking, clawing at the tubing tears streaming down my face. The darkness was thick, the kind of darkness that makes your heartbeat sound louder than anything else. I stumbled to the outlet and found the plug pulled free. My legs shook so badly I almost fell before getting it back in. When the air came, I sobbed. My sister's door was closed down the hall. She didn't stir. Not once. I wanted to believe it was coincidence. I wanted to believe she wasn't capable of something so cruel. But my body knew. That primal, quiet knowledge that lives inside the chest told me the truth before my mind did. She had touched the machine. She had watched me suffocate, and she had done nothing. A week later, it stopped being quiet accidents. It became something she wanted me to see. One morning, I came out of my room and found the machine unplugged again. This time, she was sitting on the couch, sipping her coffee, staring right at it. "You should really be more careful," she said without blinking. I asked why she didn't plug it back in. She shrugged. Not my job. It wasn't the words that terrified me. It was the way she said them, the casual cruelty. Like my breath was a switch she could flick on and off whenever she wanted. That night, when I tried to sleep, I left the machine light on and stared at it for hours, too afraid to close my eyes. I didn't tell anyone. Not my doctor. Not Marianne next door. Not even the church ladies who checked in every week. I thought telling would make it real. I wasn't ready for that. Then came the first time she pushed me. I was standing in the hallway holding the tubing and trying to adjust the settings. She came up behind me muttering something about me taking up space and brushed past. Her shoulder hit mine just hard enough to throw me off balance. I stumbled. My hand caught the wall, the tubing snapped against my cheek, and for a split second my airway tightened like a vice. She didn't stop to help. She didn't look back. She kept walking like nothing happened. That was when the dread stopped whispering and started screaming inside me. She wasn't just letting the machine fail anymore. She was testing me, seeing how much she could take before I broke. Later that week, she accidentally left the house with my portable tank in the trunk of her car. She knew I had an appointment. She left anyway. I called her until my hands shook, and when she finally answered, she laughed. "You're so dramatic, Ellie. It's just a tank. I'll be home soon." By the time she returned, I had canceled the appointment, my lungs raw from fighting to stay calm. That night, I stood at the window clutching the tubing like a lifeline and watched her walk across the lawn in the dark. She was humming. I wondered if she knew what she was doing, or if something inside her had always known. When people asked how we were, I smiled and said fine. But the walls inside that house knew better. Every corner carried the weight of her hands on things that should have kept me safe. I started sleeping with my portable tank beside me. I checked the plug 5 times before bed. I memorized the sound of the machine so I would wake if it stopped again. The first real act of violence came 3 weeks later. I was in the kitchen filling a water glass when she reached down, grabbed the tubing near my chest, and yanked it hard. Not enough to rip it out completely, just enough to make me stumble to choke for one horrible second. She laughed. A sharp, quiet sound that froze me in place. "Relax," she said. "I was just teasing." Teasing. She had found a new game. I stood there clutching the counter, gasping, feeling the pulse of air return. She walked away like nothing had happened. I remember pressing my palm against my sternum that night, feeling the way my heart was trying to catch up to what my mind already knew. She wasn't just jealous anymore. She was dangerous. And the worst part was no one would believe me. To them, Sophie was the strong sister who had taken care of me all these years. To me, she had become the storm at the end of every breath. It was only the beginning. And somewhere deep down, I knew the first real battle was coming. Thanksgiving was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be one of the few days in the year where the walls of the house stopped closing in. The turkey had been in the oven since early morning. My Aunt Ruth was bringing sweet potato casserole. My cousin Julia had promised her famous cornbread. I sat near the living room window, the nasal cannula resting gently beneath my nose, feeling the hum of the oxygen concentrator behind me. It was the only sound that ever really mattered. That machine meant life. Sophie had been pacing since dawn. She liked hosting. She liked being seen as the caretaker, the one who held things together. But her pacing was different this year. Sharper. Every time she passed the machine, her eyes flicked to the cord, like she was thinking about something she wasn't supposed to think. I tried not to notice, but ignoring Sophie had become like ignoring a loaded gun on the table. When guests arrived, Sophie greeted them with that bright, practiced smile. "She's been having a rough time lately," she told Aunt Ruth as if I wasn't standing right there. "But I've been doing everything I can to keep her comfortable." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just nodded like always. Because in a family where the story gets told by the loudest voice, truth is a fragile thing. We sat around the table. Laughter bounced off the walls. Julia poured cider. Aunt Ruth asked about my breathing, and before I could answer, Sophie leaned in and said, "She's weaker than last year." She doesn't say it, but I can tell. My fork froze in mid-air. My lungs tightened not from illness, but from fury. She wasn't just rewriting my story anymore. She was performing it for applause. Halfway through the meal, she touched her chest dramatically and let out a soft cough. It was subtle, but she had practiced it for months. Julia asked if she was okay. Sophie gave a shy smile. "It's been harder to breathe lately." I could feel every pair of eyes turn to her. Not me. Her. She drank in their concern like warm wine. "Don't worry about me," she added softly. "I've learned to live with it." Aunt Ruth squeezed her hand. Julia asked about symptoms. I sat there like a ghost in my own life. That should have been my warning. But the real storm came after dessert. Everyone had left. The house had grown quiet again. Sophie and I were alone. She was standing by the sink, rinsing dishes, slowly humming a hymn under her breath. I moved toward my room, the tubing trailing behind me. I passed the kitchen doorway. She said my name. "Ellie." I stopped. She didn't turn around. "You don't need this house," she said softly. "You can't take care of it. You can't take care of yourself." I told her it wasn't hers to take. She set the dish down gently, like someone placing a chess piece. Then she pulled a stack of papers from the counter and turned to face me. "Sign these." I stared at the words, "property transfer," at the top of the page. My breath caught. "No." Her face didn't change. "I'm the one who takes care of this place. I'm the one who keeps the power on. I should own it." I told her she wasn't taking my home. That was when she looked at the machine. A slow, deliberate glance. Then maybe she said softly, "We should talk about how much air you really deserve." She stepped forward. Her hand brushed the tubing. It was light, almost casual. My pulse spiked. I backed up a step. She followed. Her hand slid down the tube until it reached the connection point, and then, with terrifying calm, she yanked. The cannula ripped from my nose. My breath vanished in a single heartbeat. My body spasmed. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time she did it like this, deliberately. I stumbled against the wall hands clawing for the tube, but she had it. She wrapped it around her palm like a leash. "Sign the papers," she said, her voice low and measured. "I'll plug it back in. You'll breathe." Simple. I shook my head. My throat burned. My chest felt like it was being crushed under a heavy stone. My oxygen saturation dropped fast. I could feel it. My lips tingled. My vision pulsed black. She stepped closer. Her breath smelled like coffee and sugar. "This house was always mine," she whispered. "You just borrowed it." My body was screaming. My lungs dragged for air like someone scraping nails against stone. I reached toward the oxygen tank near the wall, but she saw it. She kicked it out of reach with a practiced flick of her foot. I fell to my knees dizzy, the world tilting sideways. She crouched down, still holding the tubing. "Sign it, Ellie," she said, "or stop breathing." The sound of my own choking filled the room. I pressed my hand against the floor, inching toward the coffee table where I kept my phone, but she anticipated it. She nudged it with her foot, sliding it farther away. I saw her face clearly then. No panic, no rage. Just that same calm she had the night she first pulled the plug. She was in control. She was enjoying it. I forced myself to focus. My hand went to my chest where a small pendant hung beneath my shirt. Inside the pendant was a tiny voice recorder. I had bought it years ago to capture my students' performances when I was still teaching. I had kept it out of habit. I pressed the button with a trembling thumb. It clicked softly, almost inaudible, but it was enough. Her voice, the sound of the tubing stretching the threat, it was all there. "Sign the papers," she repeated slower this time. "Sign them or die right here on the floor." My lungs convulsed. I fell sideways, grabbing the edge of the table, trying to keep my airway open. My lips burned, my head throbbed, my vision blurred at the edges. I had never felt this close to the edge. I wasn't sure if she realized how quickly oxygen deprivation worked. Maybe she didn't care. Her power wasn't just in the house. It was in every breath I took. I thought about that night when we were kids, and she held my hand while I gasped for air in the cold. I thought about how she used to save me, and now she was the one who could end me. I couldn't let her win. My fingers brushed against the base of the tank. It was just close enough to hook with two shaking fingertips. She saw it too. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer, tightening the tubing. "Don't you dare!" My lungs screamed. My heart thundered against my ribs. I pressed the emergency release on the portable tank. A weak hiss filled the air. She froze for half a second. It was enough. I dragged the tank toward me, fumbling the nasal cannula back into my nostrils. Air rushed in. Not enough, but enough to stop the spinning. Enough to fight. She lunged forward and tried to grab the tank. I kicked back, weak but desperate. The valve clanged against the floor. She stood over me, her face twisted into something I didn't recognize. "You're pathetic," she spat. "Pathetic and weak." I forced myself to sit up. My breaths were shallow and shaky, but they were mine again. She stared at me, then at the unsigned papers. Her control was slipping and she knew it. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll sign, one way or another." She stormed out of the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway like distant thunder. I sat on the floor, clutching the tank, gasping, trembling, the recording still running beneath my shirt. I stared at the machine's quiet blinking light and realized how close she had come to taking everything. It wasn't just about the house. It never was. It was about the power of deciding whether I breathed. And that power had nearly killed me. I sat there for minutes or maybe hours, my body too weak to move. The night grew cold. The house, once filled with laughter hours before, now felt like a tomb, and somewhere deep down a truth settled like a stone in my chest. She wouldn't stop, not until she got everything. My air, my home, my life. I reached for my phone, hands still shaking, and considered calling Marianne next door. But my voice was too weak, my trust too broken. I didn't call anyone. I wrapped the tubing tighter, sat in the quiet, and made a silent promise to myself. I would not die on this floor. I would not give her the house. And one day she would regret what she had done. She had turned my oxygen into a weapon, but she didn't know I was already fighting back. The recording would be my first weapon. The air that she tried to take would be the breath that would expose her. The house changed after that night. It wasn't just a house anymore. It became a trap, a closed box with stale air where every corner carried the weight of what she had done. I used to move around freely, rolling my oxygen tubing from room to room like a lifeline. But after Thanksgiving, every step I took was laced with caution. The walls had ears. The quiet meant danger. The hum of the machine, once a comfort, became a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Sophie started tightening her control like a slow tightening of a noose. It began with the portable tanks. One morning, I woke to find the cabinet where I kept my backup supply locked with a small padlock. When I asked her about it, she smiled with that infuriating calm and said, "It's for safety." I told her I needed access to those tanks in case of an emergency. She shrugged. "Then you'll just have to ask nicely." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but the message was steel. My air wasn't mine anymore. It was hers to grant. A few days later, the landline phone went dead. I checked the outlet. The cord had been pulled and wrapped around the back of the table leg. She claimed she was cleaning. Then the Wi-Fi disappeared. I found the router unplugged and shoved into the drawer under the television. She told me she was tired of paying for internet since I barely used it anyway. When I tried to plug it back in, she yanked the cord from my hand with a smile that made my stomach drop. "Why are you making everything so difficult?" she asked softly. "I just want what's fair." The isolation deepened one cut at a time. She took my car keys, saying I shouldn't be driving with my condition. She removed the batteries from the doorbell. When I asked why she'd done it, she leaned close and said, "So people will stop bothering us." She began watching me constantly. Not in the overt way a guard watches a prisoner, but in small, invasive ways. When I turned down the hallway, I'd see her standing at the end, arms folded. If I went into the kitchen, she'd follow a few minutes later, pretending to make tea. At night, I'd hear her footsteps outside my bedroom door, slow and deliberate, like she wanted me to know she was there. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake, listening to the oxygen machine hum, praying it wouldn't stop. Sometimes I'd jolt awake at the smallest sound, convinced she'd unplugged it again. Once around 2 in the morning, I opened my eyes and saw her standing in the doorway, not moving, just watching me. The soft glow of the machine light reflected in her eyes. When she noticed I was awake, she smiled, turned, and walked away without a word. I wanted to believe she was sleepwalking, but the way she smiled told me she was wide awake. Sophie began taking pieces of my security apart in quieter ways, too. She started intercepting my mail. My medical supply company called to confirm an order change I had never made. She'd requested to reduce my monthly oxygen delivery. I called back the next day to reverse it, but she intercepted that too. "You need less," she said. "You spend too much on all this." My insurance statements stopped arriving. She told me they must have gotten lost in the mail. She even moved my medication pillbox from the bedside table to a high kitchen cabinet I couldn't easily reach. When I told her to stop, she said, "I'm helping you stay organized." Every word she spoke was coated with false kindness. Every action said something different. One evening, I tried to walk out to the porch with my portable tank, just to feel fresh air, but the front door wouldn't open. She had installed a slide lock on the outside without telling me. I knocked on the door frame. She came out from the living room and tilted her head like she didn't know why I was upset. "We have to keep the house secure," she said. "There are people out there who'd take advantage of you." I looked through the window at Marianne's porch light glowing softly across the street. She was right there, but it felt like miles away. I started timing my movements for the few moments when Sophie left the house. She never went far. She worked fewer shifts at the diner now, claiming she wasn't feeling well, a mirror of the sickness she liked to wear like perfume. When she did leave, I'd unlock the cabinet with a hairpin I'd hidden under my pillow and drag one spare tank to my room. But she noticed. She always noticed. She started counting the tanks, marking the metal with tiny scratches near the handles, so she'd know if I touched them. I began to feel like a fugitive in my own home. The fear crept into everything. Eating, sleeping, breathing. One night I turned on the television too loud, and she walked in and stood behind me silent for so long that the back of my neck prickled. Then she whispered, "You should save your energy." It wasn't about television. It was about control. She wanted me to shrink until I fit into the space she allowed. The worst was the night she cut the backup tubing. It was just after midnight. I woke up because the air felt wrong. I reached for the emergency line near my bed and found it severed, sliced clean in 3 places. The edges were smooth, like they'd been cut with kitchen shears. My hands shook as I held the limp pieces. In the kitchen, I heard her humming. That same hymn from Thanksgiving night. I walked out trembling. She was sitting at the table, scissors in hand, cutting coupons from a newspaper like nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled. "Problem?" she asked. I held up the tubing. She shrugged. "Maybe it got caught on something." My throat burned. "You cut it," I whispered. "Why would you do that?" She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "You've always been dramatic." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But running wasn't an option for someone tethered to a machine. That was the cruelty of it. She didn't need chains. She just had to control the air. She grew bolder. She started switching off the machine in daylight just to watch how long it took me to notice. She'd flick the switch off casually on her way to the kitchen. I'd hear the hum die and scramble to turn it back on. She'd watch me from the doorway sipping coffee like it was all a game. "You should be more careful," she'd say. "You're too dependent on this thing." One afternoon, she cornered me near the hallway. I tried to pass, but she placed her hand on the tubing and held it there. Not pulling, just holding. I froze. She leaned close. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if this thing just stopped one day?" Her breath brushed my ear. I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. She released the tube and walked away. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my teeth. I began sleeping with a kitchen knife hidden under the mattress. Not because I ever intended to use it, but because the weight of it made me feel less helpless. I counted the seconds between breaths before I fell asleep. Some nights I imagined what would happen if the machine stopped and she didn't plug it back in. The image of her smile burned itself into the darkness. She was stripping me of every safety net I had, turning my illness into her tool. And worst of all, no one saw it. Outside, she was the devoted sister. She told everyone at church she had taken time off work to care for me. People praised her kindness, her strength. No one knew that behind the closed door of our house, she was dismantling me piece by piece. I started doubting myself. She'd whisper little things, sewing cracks in my reality. "You're overreacting. You're forgetting things again. You're not as sick as you pretend to be." It was like being smothered in slow motion. One night, I tried calling Marianne, but when she picked up, I froze. What could I say? That my sister was stealing my oxygen, that she was unplugging the machine, that she watched me choke and smiled. No one would believe that. Sophie was too good at pretending, so I hung up without a word. The world outside shrank away. I stopped answering texts. I stopped going to church. Every inch of my life contracted to the walls of that house and the sound of the oxygen machine. I became small. That's what she wanted. But the thing about pressure is that it can crush or it can harden. And somewhere beneath the fear, a part of me started to harden. The pendant with the recorder was still around my neck. Every whisper, every laugh, every flick of that switch was being captured, and she didn't know it. She thought she was isolating me, but what she didn't see was that she was building her own confession, one breath at a time. The night everything began to crack open wasn't marked by a scream or a crash. It was marked by silence, a silence so sharp it cut through the walls like a blade. It was late, close to midnight, and the winter air outside hung heavy over the neighborhood. From my room, I could see the faint glow of Marianne's porch light across the street, a steady dot in the dark that had always comforted me. The hum of my oxygen machine should have been the other sound keeping me company, but that night I woke to silence again. Not the small, quiet pauses I'd gotten used to, but a silence so absolute it punched the air out of my chest. My lungs screamed as soon as I opened my eyes. The machine had been turned off. Not unplugged, turned off. A deliberate act. Sophie was sitting in the living room, visible through the half-open door, leaning back in the armchair like someone who had all the time in the world. She was holding the remote in her hand and twirling it slowly, smiling faintly, humming under her breath. I struggled upright, every breath a fight, every movement sending a cold wave of panic through me. "Sophie!" I gasped. She didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, listening to the sound of me choking. "I told you," she said, finally, her voice too calm. "This house isn't yours." I tried to reach the machine, but she had coiled the tubing around the base of the chair. She watched me crawl toward it with the soft curiosity of someone watching a show she'd already seen before. I clawed at the carpet, dragging myself forward inch by inch. She didn't stop me, not yet. She liked to let me get close before tightening the leash. Her smile widened. I couldn't yell. There wasn't enough air for yelling. I could barely make sound. And that's when, from outside, a light flicked on. Marianne's window. She always noticed small things. The machine's hum had been part of the nightly soundscape for the entire street. The neighbors joked they could tell the time by its rhythm. And now it was gone. Marianne stepped onto her porch in her robe, holding a flashlight. She stared at our house, her brow furrowed. Sophie's smile faltered slightly. I saw the flicker in her eyes. She liked control, but she didn't like witnesses. Marianne approached the front door and knocked. Hard. Sophie didn't move at first. She just sat there letting me struggle. My vision blurred and black spots crowded the edges of my sight. Marianne knocked again, louder. "Sophie, Ellie, everything okay in there?" Her voice was warm but firm, the voice of someone who had spent years as a nurse and knew when something was wrong. Sophie finally stood up slowly like a predator trying not to spook its prey. She glanced down at me, then at the machine, then toward the door. "You stay quiet," she whispered. "You say anything, and I swear." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her eyes said the rest. Then she turned and opened the door, plastering that sweet, self-sacrificing smile on her face. "Oh, Marianne, hi," she said. "We're fine. Ellie's just asleep." Marianne's eyes swept over her shoulder. She couldn't see me fully from the doorway, but she heard something. My shallow, scraping breaths weren't quiet anymore. Years of medical work had sharpened her instincts. She took a step forward. "Can I come in for a second?" she asked. Sophie laughed lightly. "It's so late. Really, we're fine." But Marianne wasn't buying it. She pushed the door open another inch. "I just want to check on her. The machine's off." I noticed. Sophie froze for a fraction of a second. Then she tilted her head and forced another smile. I must have tripped over the cord again. It was the same line she'd used on me a dozen times. But this time, it wasn't me she was talking to. It was someone who actually knew what that machine meant. Marianne's gaze sharpened. "That doesn't sound right. That machine doesn't just turn off," she said, "and Ellie never sleeps without it." I saw Sophie's knuckles tighten on the doorknob. She was cornered, and she knew it. Marianne stepped inside fully, her flashlight beam slicing through the living room and landing on me. I was half collapsed against the coffee table, the tubing stretched out uselessly beside me, my lips tinged with blue. Marianne gasped and dropped to her knees beside me in an instant. "Oh my God, Ellie," she whispered. Her hands moved fast, practiced. She turned on the machine, checked the tubing, repositioned the nasal cannula with the precision of someone who had done this before. Air flooded back into me like a tidal wave. My vision cleared just enough to see Sophie standing there frozen. Her mask was cracking. Marianne looked up at her slowly, not with confusion, but with understanding. She had seen enough in her years at the hospital to recognize what neglect looked like. But this wasn't neglect. This was something darker. Marianne's voice was calm but firm when she said, "I'm calling 911. "Hi, my man." Sophie snapped out of her trance. "What?" "No, there's no need." "She's blue, Sophie," Marianne said sharply. "This isn't a joke." Sophie stepped forward, her hand slightly raised as if to block the door. Marianne didn't flinch. "Move," she said. Her voice carried a quiet authority that only nurses who've stared death in the face can have. Sophie stepped back. Marianne grabbed her phone from her robe pocket and called emergency services. Her voice was steady-clipped, efficient. 55-year-old female COPD, oxygen deprivation, possible domestic endangerment. Address 324 Willow Lane. I lay there shaking, clutching the tubing like it was a rope pulling me back from the edge. Sophie paced like a trapped animal, muttering something under her breath. Within minutes, red and blue lights splashed across the living room walls. The sound of sirens filled the night. The paramedics rushed in. Sophie tried to speak over them, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but Marianne didn't let her. She didn't just fall asleep, she told them. This machine was off, and she didn't turn it off herself. One paramedic checked my vitals, another checked the concentrator. They exchanged a look. It wasn't the look of people who believed Sophie. It was the look of people who saw this kind of thing more often than anyone wants to admit. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Marianne caught my eye. She didn't say anything, but the weight of her steady gaze told me I wasn't alone anymore. The night air outside hit my face cold and clean, nothing like the stale air inside the house. I heard Sophie behind me trying to explain, her voice cracking under pressure. The paramedics didn't listen. They secured me in the ambulance, the sound of the oxygen hiss steady and strong, and for the first time in months, I felt the tiniest flicker of safety. Sophie's face appeared at the back door of the ambulance, pale and tight. Marianne stood beside her with her arms crossed, eyes sharp as steel. She wasn't leaving, and Sophie knew it. That was the night her control began to slip for good. When I returned home from the hospital that night, something had shifted. Not just in the air, but in the balance between us. Sophie stood at the door when the paramedics helped me inside, her face pale and stretched tight like old fabric. Marianne followed behind, refusing to leave me alone with her. Sophie forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm so glad you're okay," she said softly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The illusion she had built for months was starting to crack. Marianne hovered near the hallway, arms folded, eyes scanning the machine and the tubing with the sharp gaze of someone who had already made up her mind. She didn't trust Sophie anymore, and Sophie knew it. She tried to regain control in small ways at first. She went to the kitchen to make tea, pretending the flashing blue lights outside had been just some kind of misunderstanding. "You scared me tonight," she said when she came back holding a mug that she didn't offer me. "You should be more careful. You can't just go turning the machine off like that." The lie came easily, but it didn't stick the way it used to. Marianne didn't even bother to respond. She had already told the responding officers about what she saw, and though they couldn't arrest Sophie on the spot without further evidence, the paramedics had made a formal report. A file existed now. That was new. For months, it had just been my word against her games. Now someone else had witnessed it. The power she'd held so carefully had developed cracks, and the more she felt it slipping, the more desperate she became. I started to see it in her eyes. That old calm was gone, replaced by something sharp and wild. She started hovering near me again, but this time with agitation instead of quiet confidence. She watched me like a cornered animal. Marianne made it a habit to stop by every night after her shift. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes just her presence. She told Sophie she was making sure I didn't have another episode. What she didn't say aloud was what I already knew: she was watching Sophie. And Sophie hated it. She hated that someone was seeing behind the performance, that someone wasn't falling for her soft smiles and gentle tones. She tried to isolate me again, but now Marianne was a wall she couldn't push down. I remember the first time Sophie truly lost control. She thought Marianne had left for the night. She slammed the kitchen cabinet doors, muttering under her breath. "You've turned everyone against me," she hissed. "You think you're the victim, but you're the reason this house is falling apart." I didn't answer. I just sat on the couch with the oxygen tube coiled in my lap like a shield. She spun on me, her eyes flashing. "You've made me look like a monster." The way she said it made my blood run cold because she wasn't denying it. She was furious that someone finally saw it. She lunged toward the machine, her hand hovering over the power switch. But before she could touch it, Marianne stepped out from behind the hallway door. "Go ahead," she said sharply. "Touch it and you'll spend the night in handcuffs." Sophie froze, her hand still in the air. Marianne's voice didn't waver. The paramedics made a note of what they saw. "The cops know what's happening here now. If she dies, they won't call it an accident." Sophie pulled her hand back slowly, her jaw clenching so tightly I could hear her teeth grind. She backed away from the machine, but the fury in her eyes burned hot. For the first time, she wasn't the one controlling the room. I saw it happen. Her grip on me cracked like glass under a hammer. She turned to Marianne, spitting the words like poison. "You don't belong here. This is our house." Marianne didn't blink. Not anymore. It wasn't just a statement. It was a line drawn in stone. That night, Marianne stayed in the guest room. She said it was to make sure I was safe. I knew it was also because she didn't trust Sophie not to try again. Sophie slammed her door shut like a child denied a toy. The house felt different with someone else inside. The air still carried tension, but it wasn't just mine to bear anymore. I didn't tell Marianne about the recording pendant yet. I kept that secret tucked close to my chest because it was my insurance policy. Sophie didn't know it existed, and that gave me power she couldn't take. The next morning, she tried to act like nothing had happened. She made pancakes, wore her soft sweater, smiled at Marianne as if they were just two women caring for an ailing relative. But her eyes told a different story. She looked at me like I was the rope in a tug-of-war she couldn't stand to lose. When Marianne stepped out to take a call, Sophie leaned close to me and whispered, "You can't keep her here forever." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She already felt it slipping away. In the following days, Marianne made quiet moves that Sophie couldn't block. She called the utility company and added me as the primary contact again. She brought over a spare Wi-Fi router and set it up in my bedroom away from Sophie's reach. She gave me a small emergency pendant she used to keep for her late husband, something that connected straight to 911. Sophie tried to argue, but Marianne shut her down with quiet, unwavering authority. "If you really care about your sister," she said, "then you'll support this." Sophie didn't support it. She sulked, paced, and muttered under her breath. She spent hours locked in her room, probably trying to figure out how to claw back what she thought was hers. But the truth was simple. She couldn't unplug silence anymore. She couldn't make me invisible again. The illusion had broken. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the steady hum of the oxygen machine, I thought about how strange it felt to breathe without fear. For months, that hum had been a reminder of danger. Now, with Marianne down the hall, it sounded different. It sounded like a boundary Sophie couldn't cross so easily. She still lingered. I still saw her shadow moving past my door at night. But now she wasn't the only one watching. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a place where too many stories like mine had been told. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the nasal cannula and sat down at the front row, the steady hiss of the portable oxygen tank filling the room with a soft, unmistakable rhythm. Sophie sat at the defense table dressed in a beige sweater and pearls, like she was some innocent, misunderstood caregiver. She had brushed her hair perfectly, her face pale but composed. To anyone who didn't know the truth, she might have looked like the grieving sister of a fragile woman. But I knew the face behind the mask. I'd stared at it while gasping for air on my own floor. I glanced over at Marianne, who sat on my right, with her arms folded and her chin raised slightly. She wasn't just here as a witness. She was my anchor. She'd been there the night Sophie finally showed the world what she was capable of. Across from us sat the prosecutor, a lean woman with dark hair tied in a low knot. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had the evidence. A few rows behind some neighbors and a couple of people from church filled the benches. I could feel their eyes shifting between us, trying to reconcile the woman they thought Sophie was with the story they were about to hear. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in quiet unison. Sophie didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, but her jaw was tight, the muscles twitching like a dam straining against a flood. The opening statements blurred at first. Words about duty of care, about endangerment, about coercion. It wasn't until the prosecutor stood and said the words oxygen deprivation and weaponization of illness that the air in the room shifted. People leaned forward, eyes widened. Sophie's fingers gripped the edge of the table just enough to make the tendons show. When the prosecutor began laying out the timeline, it was like watching my private nightmare projected on a screen. She spoke about the unplugged machines, the severed tubing, the isolated house. She described the night Marianne found me on the floor, lips blue machine off. She spoke clearly, firmly, and with enough detail to make even the clerk stop fidgeting with her pen. But it wasn't just words. It was the moment the prosecutor reached into her briefcase and pulled out the small silver pendant with the hidden recorder that everything cracked wide open. Sophie stiffened. She hadn't known about the recording. The prosecutor pressed play. Her voice echoed through the silent courtroom like a blade cutting through glass. Sophie's voice. Calm, smooth, terrifying. Sign the papers or die right here on the floor. There was a collective intake of breath. Even the judge's expression changed, his neutral facade slipping for a heartbeat. The sound of me choking followed, my hands scrabbling against the floor, the dull clang of the tank rolling away. Sophie's voice again colder this time. "You don't need this house. I do." Sophie shifted in her seat, her pale hands tightening into fists. The defense attorney tried to object, citing context, but the judge overruled it almost immediately. The recording continued to play unrelenting. Every second of her cruelty was laid bare. My heart pounded not from fear anymore, but from the weight of finally being heard. When it ended, the courtroom was utterly silent. No one coughed. No one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor let the silence stretch before she said softly, "This is what Ellie Warren lived with for months. Every day. Every night. In her own home." Sophie finally turned toward me then. Her eyes weren't cold anymore. They were wide, panicked, furious. She looked at me like I'd ripped the ground out from under her feet, and in a way, I had. For months, she had controlled the narrative. She had painted herself as the hero and me as the weak sister. But in this room, with her voice echoing back at her, she wasn't the hero anymore. She was the villain. The defense tried to spin it, of course. They said she was exhausted, overwhelmed by caregiving, that she never intended harm. They painted her as someone who made mistakes under pressure. But the recording didn't sound like pressure. It sounded like intent. Cold and steady. Like someone who believed no one would ever know. Marianne took the stand. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades in emergency rooms. She described the night she saw the machine off the look on Sophie's face, the way I'd been lying on the floor gasping for air. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Every word carried the weight of something undeniable. Then it was my turn. The bailiff helped me to the stand, steadying the portable oxygen tank at my side. The courtroom looked bigger from up here. Sophie stared at me, her lips pressed tight. I didn't look away. I spoke slowly, carefully, but clearly. I told them everything: the unplugged machines, the padlocked tanks, the stolen mail, the way she stood in my doorway at night like a shadow waiting for the right moment. I told them about Thanksgiving, about the papers, about the moment I thought my last breath had already arrived. I didn't cry. My voice shook sometimes, but I didn't cry, because this was no longer a story whispered into the dark. It was truth spoken out loud. When I finished, the prosecutor asked one final question. "Why didn't you leave?" I took a deep breath through the tubing. "Because I thought no one would believe me," I said. "Because I thought she'd win." The judge's face softened just enough for me to notice. When the defense had its turn to cross-examine, Sophie's lawyer tried to paint me as confused, fragile, a woman with an illness whose perception might be clouded. He tried to suggest Marianne was over-involved, that she misunderstood what she saw. But the recording was like an anchor they couldn't pry loose. Every time they tried to twist the narrative, those words echoed in the room. "Sign the papers or die." At closing, the prosecutor stood tall and said, "You cannot claim love while turning off the very air someone needs to live." This was not a moment of weakness. This was power wielded like a weapon. When the jury filed out, I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of years leave my shoulders. Sophie sat perfectly still, but I could see the crack in her mask widen. She wasn't the one holding the air anymore. The court was. And soon, justice would decide. The verdict came in the late afternoon when the sun filtered through the courthouse windows and cast long, slanted beams across the room. Everyone was quiet when the jury filed back into their seats. My heart beat against the cannula at my chest, the steady hiss of oxygen filling the silence. Sophie sat rigid at the defense table, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a second, she almost looked small. But then I remembered the way she smiled when she cut my air off, the way she stood over me while I gasped. She wasn't small. She was dangerous. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. The words came crisp and clean. Guilty on all counts of endangerment, coercion, and aggravated assault. It felt like the air in the room expanded, like it finally belonged to me again. Sophie didn't move at first. She blinked slowly, as if the verdict needed time to sink in. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. She lifted her head then, and her eyes met mine. There was no apology in them, only shock and a burning fury that said she never thought she'd lose. For months, she'd been judge, jury, and executioner inside that house. But here in this courtroom, her power meant nothing. Marianne squeezed my hand, gently grounding me. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, her face still composed, but her eyes softened just a fraction. The judge read the sentencing terms. Sophie was to serve time, followed by probation with a permanent restraining order. She was barred from the house from approaching me, from contacting me in any way. She tried to speak then, standing abruptly. "This isn't fair," she hissed. "You're twisting everything. I took care of her." The bailiff stepped forward, steady and silent. The judge's voice cut through her protests like a clean blade. "You took away her air. That is not care. That is cruelty." Sophie froze, her lips parted, but no sound coming out. It was the first time someone had named what she had done out loud where the world could hear it. As the bailiff moved to escort her out, some of the neighbors who had believed her version of things turned their faces away. The mask she had worn so well for years was gone, shattered under the weight of her own words on that recording. She twisted toward me as she passed, her expression sharp, but there was nothing she could do anymore. She wasn't the one holding the tubing. She wasn't the one who decided whether I breathed. Outside, the winter air hit me like a clean tide, cold and clear and mine. The courthouse steps were crowded with people talking in hushed voices. Mary Ann stood beside me, one hand resting gently on my arm. I could feel my body still shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was release. The house that once felt like a prison now belonged to me alone. I wasn't sure what the future would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, it was mine to shape. Sophie's shadow would always be a scar somewhere deep in my memory, but the weight she held over me had cracked. Justice had spoken, and for once it spoke my language. After the verdict, the house felt unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into a space both mine and not mine. It was the same creaking floors, the same peeling paint on the porch, the same old clock ticking in the hallway, but everything felt quieter. Not the terrifying silence of the nights when Sophie had turned off the machine, but a new silence. A clean one. Mary Ann helped me pack away the things Sophie had touched. Her locked cabinet was gone. The extra tanks were stacked neatly in my room again, and the router light blinked softly like a small, stubborn heartbeat. For months, I had breathed in that house like a fugitive hiding from her own sister. Now, when I woke up at night and listened to the oxygen machine hum, it didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like breathing. Real breathing. I began to move through the house, slowly reclaiming the corner she had turned against me. The kitchen window over the sink where she used to hum while watching me struggle. The hallway where she used to stand in the dark. The living room chair where she had sat with the tubing wrapped in her hand like a leash. I opened the curtains. I let the light in. Mary Ann started coming over less often, not because she didn't care, but because she trusted I was safe now. That was the biggest gift she could give me. Safety. I joined a support group for patients with COPD at the local clinic. The first time I walked in with my portable tank, people nodded at me with quiet understanding. They didn't need explanations. They had all lived their own versions of fear and fragility. Some talked about the disease. Some talked about family. I listened. I spoke. For the first time, my story wasn't whispered into the void. It was heard and believed. Mary Ann invited me to her house for Sunday dinners. The first time I sat at her table, I realized I had spent so many years breathing around Sophie, never with ease. But here, the air was warm and ordinary. It didn't feel like borrowed air anymore. The church people who had once believed Sophie's performance began approaching me with quiet apologies. Some offered words, some brought flowers. I didn't hate them. They had seen the mask, not the monster behind it. Sophie's absence lingered like a faint shadow, but it wasn't suffocating. It was just there. A reminder. I started planning changes. The locks were replaced. A small alarm was installed on the concentrator in case of emergencies. I bought myself a new blanket, new dishes, even a new pair of slippers. Little things. But they were mine. Sophie had taken my breath and turned it into a weapon. Now I was learning how to own it again. Some nights, I sat on the porch with Mary Ann and watched the neighborhood lights flicker. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for footsteps in the hallway. I wasn't waiting for someone to pull the plug. My breaths were shaky but steady, fragile but free. I was still healing, and healing was slow, but it was mine to do. The morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, warm and soft against the pale yellow walls, and for the first time in years, it felt like it belonged here. The oxygen machine hummed gently in the background, a steady and familiar sound that no longer carried the weight of fear. I sat at the small wooden table with a cup of tea in my hands, watching the light shift across the floorboards, and felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Stillness. True stillness. Mary Ann had left an hour earlier after her usual check-in, but she hadn't lingered like she used to. She trusted me to breathe on my own now. That was something most people would never think twice about, but for me, it was a quiet victory. Breathing without permission. Breathing without fear. The house was smaller now, not because it had changed, but because Sophie's presence had stretched it like a dark shadow, and that shadow was finally gone. There was still an empty space where she had sat, where she had watched me choke, where she had convinced herself she was untouchable. But it wasn't power anymore. It was absence. And absence is easier to live with than fear. A few weeks after the sentencing, the town moved on the way small towns always do. People whispered at the grocery store, at the church steps, at the gas station. But whispers no longer stung. They were just echoes of something that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Sophie's name belonged to court records, now not to my oxygen machine. The house was mine again. My lawyer had arranged for the restraining order to be permanent, and her lawyer had tried to negotiate, but there was no room left for negotiation. She had taken that away the moment she wrapped her hand around the tube that kept me alive. I had spent months imagining that moment, the one where justice finally lands. I thought it would feel like triumph, but it didn't. It felt like release. Heavy, slow, quiet release. I started therapy after the trial. My therapist was a woman with kind eyes who never flinched when I said things like, "I thought I would die on that floor," or "I still listen for footsteps even though she's gone." She helped me untangle the years of silence and guilt. She helped me understand that surviving something does not make it less real, that breathing again does not erase the time spent gasping. At night, I began sleeping with the window slightly open, letting the cold air settle on my skin. I had always been too afraid before. What if the tubing got pulled? What if the machines stopped? But now the sound of the night was no longer a threat. It was just night. On some nights, I dreamed of Sophie. Not the monstrous version from that Thanksgiving night, but the girl on the porch roof when we were kids. The one who used to tell me she would always protect me. I woke up from those dreams with a hollow ache, but it was different now. It wasn't fear or anger. It was mourning. Mourning for something that never really was. People sometimes ask me how it feels to have a sister who tried to take the air from your lungs. The truth is, it's not something that fits neatly into a sentence. It's something that carves itself into the space between breaths. You don't just stop remembering, but you learn to breathe around it. You learn to live with the scar. Marianne and I started going to the farmer's market every Sunday morning. She said it was good for me to get out to feel normal again. I bought small things, a basket of apples, a blue scarf, a handmade sign that says home. I hung it by the door. It sounds ordinary, but when your breath was once held hostage, ordinary becomes extraordinary. Sophie's trial had made the local news for a few days, but stories fade fast in places like this. People looked at me differently at first, like I was made of glass or tragedy. But then they started looking at me the way they used to, like just Ellie, the woman with COPD, the woman who reads on her porch, the woman who laughs with Marianne at the bakery. And slowly, I began to believe it again, too. I wasn't just the woman who survived Sophie. I was me. One cold evening, I sat outside with the porch light on and watched the last leaves fall from the old maple tree. The air was crisp, my breath soft and steady, fogging slightly in the cold. The machine beside me hissed gently, and I realized something simple but powerful. This sound was no longer tied to fear. It was tied to life. My life, my house, my air. Sophie would face her own consequences. I didn't need to follow them anymore. My story didn't end in the courtroom. It ended here, with quiet breathing morning tea and Marianne laughing in the kitchen, with sunlight slanting across the floorboards, with air that belonged to me. If you've ever had someone try to take away what keeps you alive, you know this feeling. You know the way the world becomes louder once you reclaim it. You know the way air tastes different when it's yours again. It is a kind of freedom that no one can understand until they've almost lost it. Justice didn't give me my sister back, but it gave me my breath, and that in the end is everything. If you've ever survived something like this, tell your story. Someone out there might need to hear it. Someone out there might be holding their breath, waiting to be believed.